Socratic reasoning on the truth seems like a sort of skepticism which doesn't want to claim that the only thing that's true is that it can't know, but it rather, as it were, insists on the refutation of skepticism, which is to say skepticism claims to already know what the truth is, and therefore, as though somebody would already know what a shadow is, and then say shadows don't exist. But there's a shadow there. If I now to continue to say that this thing doesn't actually exist, then I have to. I've already begun on the basis of this shadowy opinion that I know what shadows are. Likewise, the truth, it's very hard to somehow simply shake away truth, even though every attempt to completely clarify the shadow into the light, to take the vaguer path that leads out of the shadow into the light, would seem always to fail. So that yet again with Kant. So, but nonetheless, the word's still sort of in this storm of the specter of the idea of truth, which allows us to then say what would be lead to an ongoing sustenance of a order or eunomia or cosmos that was the true cosmos or moral order. And then we could pose this question, should we better attempt to emulate the credentials of Hannah Arendt or of Eichmann, the sort of technocratic Nazi who solved certain technocratic, bureaucratic problems regarding the transit of Jews to extermination camps. So Agamben is saying always Eichmann was at ease, and that the Israelis had no house of justice. He didn't have to worry about that. They had rather something they called the house of judgment, and it was organized with all kinds of bureaucratic paperwork that he was very happy to be buried in, as it were, and very he found this would somehow put him into a familiar, even in his glass box, into a rather he was sort of how do you say, he found it congenial. The whole thing, the whole trial was congenial to him, and I don't think either that he felt any great sort of totosphere or whatever, however it's totosfrucht, death, fear at the moment of death, as did the lead character in Kleist's Prince of Hamburg, which is, we'll get back to that in a second, which is dramatizes Kant's position and dramatizes also Eichmann's position exactly. So let's look first is what's the claim of Arendt. So Arendt says Kant wants to preserve the humanity in the human being, and we have this notion of the kingdom of ends. What does Kant say to that? It says, though, first of all, let me say something. It's like Kant gives like 4 examples of how his categorical maxim is to actually be understood, but this is absolutely impossible to go on 4 examples. It's like it's a problem of infinite casuistry. But okay, we have 4 examples, and all of them are rather difficult, and all of them require reasoning beyond what any, I think beyond what people that, let's say, score badly on intelligence tests can muster, for the most part. If you have like strong skills in exact reasoning and comprehension you can sort of follow Kant's arguments, but are they absolutely cogent? In his own time, they were largely not even agreed to. The whole issue about the polemic with the concept. One of Kant's examples is that if there are to be contracts, you cannot have a case, and it would be damaging to the humanity of the human being, and therefore to this cosmos, or true or perfect order. If someone were to of a contract to take out a loan, they were to in advance have the notion that they would not repay that loan, anticipating already that they wouldn't repay the loan, they take out the loan, or better, deliberately taking out the loan with the idea of not repaying it. So here already we have the subtleties, is that Kant, this is the simplest one, by the way. I think the other ones are even more difficult, but this one is already, everyone in Kant's time had trouble with this, and this is the one where he actually engaged in a polemic on part of this point, on the point of lying. And Kant's claim is, one thing that's very confusing about it is Kant makes this a priori claim, but then he still gives like sort of empirical arguments also, which makes it extremely confusing on the face of it. Maybe it's not confusing once we point that out, but it seems to me still confusing. But so his point is, it's not that he's saying, oh, the word will, it's not an empirical argument, oh, the word will get out, that some people are deliberately entering into contracts. Of course, this is obviously does happen and people know about it. The people are entering into, but Kant's point is whether you can, as a moral, deliberately as being a moral agent, do this. Some people are making contracts deliberately just to steal money from people in order, just to give them the impression that they're going to fulfill the contract and pay back the loan, but they never intended to pay back the loan. And then people hear about that and they get suspect about making contracts, and they require too much collateral, and then the good order of the state suffers from it, or something like that. Kant absolutely isn't making an argument like that. What he's saying is, a priori, if in the open, in public, of the public of reasoning, we would say there is a law of our moral conduct which says it's good for the human being to be a deceiver in this way, then all the other rational beings, not just human beings, but beings on other planets which are rational, since this is the offenlich or public reasoning that Kant is recommending, all beings would see this law of nature. Sorry, not law of nature, but law of this perfect moral order. That actually plays a role. Kant's worried about sliding into the law of nature, and that's why Eichmann is correct in his claim. So Kant is introducing this distinction, which is the thing most often, I mean, this is part of the things that are most often discussed with respect to Kant. But I've never yet seen a good argument that shows what's surely the case, that Eichmann was absolutely right and Arendt was absolutely wrong. So why? Kant says, so let's do it sort of like we were analytic philosophers. They always produce this supposed math. They've produced logic as though logic were mathematics, in contradistinction to something like a beautiful Platonic dialogue, on the notion that if you have a beautiful Platonic dialogue, things that are extraneous will be said and they'll confuse us, so that then what we really want is this statements that are almost mathematical statements, which use the sort of algebraic statements, which use the symbol P, for example, to stand for proposition. And then you could say, you could make little statements like if this, then not P, if this, then P, referring to some proposition or claim. So what's in the simplest sort of how would I would say sort of pseudo arguments of these mathematical types of arguments. They're not real arguments because they take us out of real life and isolate statements as though mathematical exactitude was the appropriate amount of exactitude for questions of the historical life of human beings, for questions of the type we're going into right now, this Eichmann case, which is obviously much more messy, and where we need to take into account the actual situation in some way. Although Kant, again, so let me make a simple comment. So of course, here when we say, is Eichmann right or is Arendt right, we could ask the question in two ways. We could ask the question absolutely, or we could ask the question is with respect to what they say about Kant's system. So of course we're talking here about what they say, what Arendt claimed about Kant's system and what Eichmann claimed about Kant's system. Eichmann is correct, Arendt is incorrect. They both made claims about Kant's system rather than about the truth simpliciter. So Kant's claim put into this artificial style would be that omnilateral, or as it were, let's say call it O, omnilateralism cannot be destroyed by unilateralism or U. O must be preserved against U. I could give it some artificial form like that, which makes it seem as though we were keeping everything extraneous out. So why is O superior to U according to Kant? Because Kant thinks dear order is absolutely trumps any claim like that of Oliver Wendell Booth or whoever to the sic semper tyrannis. I mean, so notice again, like you could ask whether Booth was empirically correct, whether Lincoln was a tyrant and what counts as a tyrant, and whether there's a right, an absolute, or that's actually simple to say, whether there's a true right, which means at the same time whether we can have moral knowledge that tells us that we ought to assassinate a tyrant, Hitler, for example. So that's exactly who's in. But at the same time, okay, so then whether we should kill a tyrant is one thing. In a specific case like that of Lincoln or Hitler, in the case of Hitler, we could probably say Hitler was absolutely a tyrant, whereas there could be arguments still, but I think it's probably nicer to concede that Hitler was a tyrant and Lincoln we're not that sure. I mean, there's the habeas corpus issue, and then there's the larger issue that Lincoln was probably aiming at the 14th Amendment and creating a state which might have been we may be now sort of reaping the fruits of what he produced and all that. This is a well-known argument in American context. 14th Amendment, the result of the Civil War, has produced this super centralized federal powers, and which have only been exacerbated in our own time, as we're seeing with the current the current situation. Okay, so Kant says, I'll include the direct citation in the notes. Kant says there cannot be either, so there's two parts to this. There cannot be killing of a tyrant, nor can there be rebellion. So it's often mentioned that Kant is against rebellion, but it's usually fobbed off in the following way. They say there can't be a rebellion because a rebellion would require deception. You have to hide, you have to have secret meetings, you have to have a Freemason society, you have to do things out of the Offentlichkeit, out of the publicness, which is what Kant requires. But that's not the essential reason that Kant is against, as the citation I show in the notes will tell you if you look at it. His essential reason is this question of dear order, and the reason why the order is so dear is because he thinks the humanity of humans is sustained by the fact that all of our normal rights to property and so on must be sustained by a state which in some way maintains order. So even the Nazi state, even a tyrannical and evil state, in some way maintains order. And Kant thinks if a state is in some way maintaining order, there's no right to rebellion against it, and there's no right to killing the tyrant, even if he is objectively a tyrant. I think that's totally covers the claim of Eichmann very simply and neatly, and Eichmann was correct. So now this, let's cap that off there and then go into some other wider issues, which would touch on the legal situation today more generally. So it's like, why do you get people like Samuel Moyne, who are by no means unusual, but who represent, as it were, the textbook version, or the version now in power, who exercise this sort of representative statistical analysis rather than taking a concern over what's true or what's right. If we're interested in what's true and what's right, it doesn't change what's true that the whole population would vote for something that's false. The voting could be useful in some way to maintaining order, but it wouldn't change that the fact that the people would vote 90% for some issue doesn't make it true by the older way of thinking. By our way of thinking, it does somehow. It's all that counts. Or I should say, when I say by our way of thinking, I would say by the way of thinking that's somehow now in power. But here's the problem is, whenever we ask these questions about what it is that's reasonable for sustaining a properly human life, and that means at the same time the humanity of a human being, the kingdom of ends, we run into all sorts of sort of infinite combinations forming in the background somehow, or we don't know how to act. Let me make this analogy just for a second. Kant, in his 4 examples in the Metaphysics of Morals of the how to apply the categorical imperative, presents something which is analogous to the opening of Hegel being Kant's successor, Hegel's logic, where Hegel makes the claim, which is, I would say, not just absurd, but almost like it seems like he's just lying, because he says anyone through the natural use of their reason. So it's like there's a notion. How do you say Nemo nascitur artifacts. Nemo nascitur artifacts. There's a saying that no one is born with an art, but that we have there's some distinction between law built up through study or the art of law, and that which we could, as it were, spontaneously teach ourselves out of our own natural nature. Kant is worried about, especially in the break of this order, is that he thinks we'll fall into this Hobbesian state of nature where that which is built up to defend the humanity and the human being will be lost with, therefore you can't have unilateral people saying, okay, we're going to kill this man and tear down this state because there's a tyrant. They may be correct that there's a tyrant, they may be correct that the state is evil, but they still can't do it because I suppose just as what as actually happened, in some way the state remaining after the storm of the Nazi period subsided, those things which could ongoingly sustain human order were more or less still in place, and so that you could have a civil order, property, and so on, in some way retained, even if there were, of course, the vast abuses that there were, and even if Jews returning from the death camps weren't immediately restored or made whole, and I guess that most of them weren't ever restored or made whole by their property, because it would be very difficult to prove and so on. And plus there would have to be, plus for practical reasons of how many courts there would have to be and so on. I'm not sure that those are the only reasons behind it, but it's not totally material to the present question, or anyway, it's not the most important thing. So Hegel makes this statement that by our natural reason, anyone would come to the conclusions he did about in the beginning of his logic, and come up with the same notions. But what he's saying is not just as complicated as what we're just attempting to go through with regard to Kant and why Kant's against lying and these other things. All these things are rather complicated. Some of them, there could be a steel-tight grasp of them, at least in what their purport and what they claim, which would then not necessarily secure that our assent to them. We might understand Kant, but not assent to what he's saying. All these attempts breaking down into the lack of agreement finally would seem to give way to voting, which is the most horrible thing imaginable, because what it means is, since you don't believe there's any possibility that even Immanuel Kant could think properly and clearly, you say, let's settle the matter by numbers. And therefore, let's settle what's true by numbers. And then this actually, once it's in practice, practical laws, of course, it's typical of America that we have a saying which is not just absurd, but simply a lie, which is that you can't legislate morality. In fact, it's been known since Aristotle, and before, I'm sure it was known long before, that that's what morality, that's the strongest way you can create morality, is through legislation, through laws. So you create a law that says, democracy is morally good, voting is morally good, And this produces a situation of disorder in an extreme way, which Kant would have never been in favor of. But okay, so again, I think this whole issue is not just the issue of whether Kant made a mistake with respect to a certain aspect of his teaching. Like, could we save the kingdom of ends and the maxim, but just say Kant made a mistake with respect to his notion that you can't kill tyrants and that you can't, under any circumstances, allow dear order to slip away. I wouldn't try to give any proof against that just immediately, but I think the proof is again, it's the same as what Heidegger accepts as though as a beginning point, which is that these things keep coming too much into theoretical revelations. They get right in our face. We're looking at them. AI gets a hold of them. They become tools of manipulation, which is why we get the word ideology and so on. And they all have this form of, you have somebody like Euclid propounds some kind of paradigm. Paradigm means really just you have an example which serves as a rule. So for instance, that parallel lines, perfect parallel lines exist, and then it comes into question, meaning not just that we could think of parallel lines, but that they actually exist in space. And then it comes into question, and then it's not just that sort of, now there's no more just algebra and Al-Khwarizmi, and algebra comes from Persia, by the way. But in any case, it was originally this notion of solving for unknowns, which is a beautiful phrase, I think, of Al-Khwarizmi. But it's not just that you get algebra and finally calculus as the end of all math, but instead you find out, there's this all kinds of ways you can create new maths, and then not just the post-Euclidean math, but all kinds of ways. And then somebody comes out with a rule and says, as long as it's consistent. And then you get people like Stephen Wolfram and stuff and say, but there's actually still some limits to it or something. And then they say, this is the limited number of maths that would be consistent according to a certain law of consistency. But you see the point. These things always ramify. They always, that's one of the points Heidegger simply faces up to, where other people don't face up to it. Other people keep turning their face from the problem, cowering and not facing up to the problem. So in this situation, we could ask those questions of, like, did Kant just make a little mistake that we could fix? But it looks like epicycles on epicycles, right? So I would say, nihilism has this sort of, is somehow close to the notion of the system of the vote, of democracy.